The night was electric, the air filled with a tension that no one could ignore. It was 1956, and the world was about to change. In a small, crowded studio, the walls reverberated with a sound that had never been heard before. The horns and drums played a rhythmic riff, and then, out of nowhere, a voice cut through the air. "Come on, baby, let the good times roll." It was the beginning of "Let the Good Times Roll," a song that would become one of the most recognizable hits of the year. But it wasn't just the music that was different, it was the voices. Shirley and Lee, a black R&B duo, were about to shatter the barriers that had long separated black and white music. Lee's deep, smooth voice was followed by Shirley's, a high-pitched, almost nasal tone that was both bizarre and alluring. "Close the door," she sang, "so we can roll all night long." The lyrics were suggestive, the beat was irresistible, and the message was clear. The good times were coming, and they were here to stay. Outside the studio, the world was changing. Elvis Presley had burst onto the scene, and his magnetic presence had sent shock waves through the music industry. But while Elvis was the face of the new rock and roll, he wasn't the only one. Across the country, black R&B artists were finding their way onto the pop charts, and their music was transforming the landscape of American culture. In 1955, only 17 black acts had made it to the pop charts. By 1956, that number had nearly doubled to 32. It was a revolution, and it was happening in plain sight. R&B artists like Shirley and Lee were not just making music. They were breaking down barriers and challenging the status quo. Their songs were not just catchy tunes, they were a call to action, a signal that the old rules no longer applied. The success of "Let the Good Times Roll" was a turning point. It wasn't a sanitized, homogenized cover of a black R&B song. It was the real deal. The earthy lyrics, the identifiable black voices, and the New Orleans rhythm and blues band created a sound that was both unique and irresistible. Teenagers across the country were listening, and they were dancing. They were rethinking their attitudes toward race, sex, and traditional pop music. The old guard was being challenged, and the new guard was rising. Meanwhile, in the world of pop music, the success of Pat Boone and Elvis Presley had sent record companies into a frenzy. They were searching for the next big thing, the next pop rock star who could capture the hearts of teenagers. The Diamonds, a white pop group with a knack for blending traditional pop harmonies with black R&B, were one of the most successful. Their cover of "Why Do Fools Fall in Love" was a hit, but it wasn't just a copy of the original. Instead, they added their own touch, a lighthearted and edgy sound that set them apart from the crowd. Other acts were also making their mark. Patience and Prudence, two sisters, found success with their sweet, adolescent-sounding vocals and songs about young love. Tommy Charles, with his focus on teenage romance, and the Four Lovers, who would later become the Four Seasons, were also making waves. Even country singers like George Hamilton, the Fourth and Sonny James were crossing over into the pop rock market, with hits about teen romance and youth culture. But the most brazen attempt to cash in on the rock and roll craze was a record called "Dear Elvis Pages 1 and 2, performed by a female artist known only as Audrey. The record was a madrigal with mimicry, a letter from a teenage fan to Elvis Presley. It was a mix of snippets from recent hits, a collage of sound that reflected the frenzied energy of the music industry. The record was a clear sign that the industry had taken notice of the Presley phenomenon and was ready to capitalize on the growing market for rock and roll. By the end of 1956, the landscape of pop music had been forever altered. The floodgates had opened and the good times were rolling. The music was changing, and with it, the world. The revolution had begun, and there was no turning back. The 1950s saw a huge shift in music, especially with the rise of R&B groups and the birth of rock and roll. The first R&B harmony groups to find success on the pop charts often had a smooth, familiar sound that appealed to audiences raised on white pop music. One of the earliest groups to make a big splash was the Orioles. They hit the national charts with songs like "What Are You Doing New Year's Eve" in 1949 and "Crying in the Chapel" in 1954. These songs had a traditional pop feel that made them easy for everyone to enjoy. Billy Ward and the Dominoes also found success with a mix of R&B and pop. Their first hit, 60-Minute Man, was a bit naughty and became a novelty hit in 1951, But they didn't stop there. They followed up with more traditional pop songs like Rags to Riches in 1953 and St. Therese of the Roses in 1956. These songs showed that they could adapt to different styles and still find success. Another group that made waves in 1956 was Otis Williams and the Charms. They covered Kathy Carr's pop hit, Ivory Tower, and made it their own, landing on the charts with a traditional pop sound. This showed that R&B groups could take pop songs and make them their own, which was a big deal at the time. But no group was more successful in the 1950s than the Platters. The Platters were made up of Tony Williams, David Lynch, Herb Reed, Paul Roby, and Zola Taylor. They hit the pop charts in 1955 with the romantic ballad, Only You. Their songs were slow, dreamy, and perfect for dancing and romancing. The Platters became one of the biggest success stories of 1956. Their song, The Great Pretender, climbed to #1 on the Billboard charts, making them the first African-American group to achieve this feat. They followed up with more hits like You've Got the Magic Touch and My Prayer, both of which did incredibly well. By the end of the year, they had added more top 20 hits, including You'll Never Know and It Isn't Right. The Platters' success was due to their excellent choice of material, well-produced records, smooth harmonies, and a performance style that was similar to traditional white pop groups of the 1940s and 1950s. Their music was perfect for the conformist era of the Cold War. Parents saw them as safe and non-threatening, and teenagers loved their sentimental songs about love and romance. They even appeared on TV shows and movies, and performed in top nightclubs across the country. While the Platters were dominating the pop charts, other R&B groups were making their mark on rock and roll. Groups like Shirley and Lee, the Cadillacs, the Moonglows, and the Five Satins were part of a new sound called doo-wop. Doo-wop was all about street corner harmonies and catchy rhythms. Shirley and Lee, for example, had a big hit with Let the Good Times Roll in 1956. The song's mix of a sad sack drawl and a piping little girl voice made it a hit, even though some pop DJ avoided it for being too suggestive. Mickey and Sylvia, a guitar-playing duo, also found success with their hit, Love is Strange. The song's hypnotic guitar riffs, Latin beat, and suggestive lyrics made it a favorite among teenage dancers. It was one of the standout records of 1956, crossing over from the R&B charts to the national pop chart. Doo-wop groups like Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers were also making waves. Frankie Lyman was just 12 years old when they hit it big with Why Do Fools Fall in Love? The group's multicultural makeup and energetic sound helped them stand out. They beat out several cover versions of their song and established doo-wop as a key part of rock and roll. Other doo-wop groups like the G-Clefs, the Moonglows, and the Clovers also found success with their original songs. The Cadillacs with Speed-U and the Five Satins with In the Still of the Night showed both the up-tempo and romantic sides of doo-wop. These songs were perfect for dancing and romantic moments, and they became some of the most requested records of the time. R&B solo artists also had their moments in 1956. While some veterans like Big Joe Turner and Wynonie Harris struggled to make the transition to rock and roll, younger artists like Clyde McPhatter found success. McPhatter's song Money Honey was a hit on the R&B charts and later became a rock and roll classic when Elvis Presley covered it. The 1950s were a time of change in music, and R&B groups and doo-wop were at the forefront of this change. They brought a new sound to the pop charts, blending traditional pop with the energy and emotion of R&B. Their success showed that music could bring people together, no matter their background or age. After McPhatter left the Drifters in 1955, he found a new path to success with his solo career. In 1956, his song Treasure of Love caught the attention of rock and roll fans. Then in 1958, A Lover's Question became a hit, peaking at #6 on the national charts. Music historian Charlie Gillett noted that the arrangement of A Lover's Question was similar to the harmony gospel groups, with a bass singer mimicking a double bass rhythm, while McPhatter delivered the emotional lyrics. While older R&B singers struggled to connect with the younger generation, a new wave of artists like Fats Domino, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard found a way to bridge the gap. Fats Domino, who was already a hit in R&B, showed in 1956 that he could also conquer the pop charts. He started the year with Bow Weevil, which didn't do too well, but then he hit his stride with a two-sided hit. I'm in Love Again climbed to number 4, and its flip side, My Blue Heaven, reached number 19. This was followed by When My Dreamboat Comes Home, which peaked at number 14. But the real magic happened in October when Blueberry Hill started climbing the charts, eventually reaching number 2 in early 1957. Dave Bartholomew, Fats's producer, was thrilled with the success of Blueberry Hill. He explained, "We made it a standard, and it will live on and on." Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, Fats Domino continued to dominate the charts with his unique blend of R&B and pop. His music had a big beat that resonated with the new generation of dancers, and his shows drew large crowds. Bartholomew, who played a crucial role in Fats's success, emphasized the importance of the New Orleans sound that they created together. Despite their disagreements, Fats and Bartholomew had a strong partnership. Fats wrote many of the lyrics and tunes, while Bartholomew handled the arrangements and production. Drummer Earl Palmer and engineer Cosimo Matassa praised Fats's creativity and talent. Even when they didn't agree, like with Ain't That a Shame, they respected each other's input and made great music together. Fats Domino's music often reflected the working-class life and everyday language of the 1950s. Songs like Blue Monday and I Want to Walk You Home captured the attitudes and speech of the time. His style was conservative, and he and Bartholomew aimed to keep their music respectful. This made Fats appealing to a wide audience, including parents who might have been wary of rock and roll. Fats Domino also played a significant role in breaking down racial barriers. He performed at both black and white venues and earned the respect of music lovers of all races. His concerts were often the first places where integrated audiences danced together. Music historian Rick Coleman noted that Fats was ground zero for racial integration and helped pave the way for a more integrated society. While Fats Domino didn't single-handedly end racial discrimination, his music brought people together in subtle but powerful ways. His hit I'm in Love Again included a playful twist on a racist children's rhyme, and he encouraged black and white audiences to dance together at his shows. Dave Bartholomew remembered that their music created a bond between musicians of different races, both in the U.S. and abroad. Fats Domino's success was rooted in his inimitable style and common man appeal. He wasn't as flashy as Elvis Presley or as wild as Little Richard, but his warm, infectious voice and distinctive piano sound made him a rock and roll legend. His music blended folk and R&B, and his lyrics came from the heart, much like the songs of people working in the fields. Fats Domino and Dave Bartholomew are now recognized as two of rock and roll's founding fathers. They have received numerous honors, including induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Songwriters Hall of Fame. Fats Domino was also awarded the National Medal of the Arts in 1998, recognizing his contribution to bringing the races together through music. As Prislamania swept the nation in 1956, Chuck Berry's Roll Over Beethoven became a top 30 hit. This wasn't Chuck's first hit. Maybelline had already reached number 5 in 1955. Roll Over Beethoven was significant because it announced the arrival of a new sound and a new era. The song referenced disc jockeys, jukeboxes, and the new rockin' rhythm records. It was a bold statement, telling the white establishment that the times were changing. Roll Over Beethoven, Chuck proclaimed, and dig these rhythm and blues. Although Roll Over Beethoven was Chuck Berry's only hit on the national pop charts in 1956, he had 3 other songs on the R&B charts: No Money Down, Too Much Monkey Business, and Brown-Eyed Handsome Man. These songs helped build his reputation as a songwriter who could connect with both white and black audiences. Chuck Berry's talent for writing teen-oriented lyrics would soon make him one of the greatest rock and roll stars of the era, with hits like School Day, Rock and Roll Music, Sweet Little 16, and Johnny B. Good becoming classics. In 1956, Chuck Berry was still working hard to prove himself as a rock and roll star. His striking appearance and electrifying performances were key to his success. Chuck was a tall, slim man with a killer smile and piercing brown eyes. On stage, he dressed in flashy tuxedos or draped jackets with pegged pants, which made him stand out. His agile movements added a dynamic visual to his music, and he quickly won over audiences with his energy and showmanship. One of Chuck's most memorable performances was at the Brooklyn Paramount in 1955. When the famous disc jockey Alan Freed introduced Chuck, the crowd went wild. Chuck played a rollicking version of Maybelline, and the audience couldn't get enough. From that moment on, Chuck's showmanship became legendary. His facial expressions, acrobatics, dance steps, and comedic moves, along with his sexually suggestive antics, captivated everyone. He often cradled his guitar near his crotch and played it at a right angle, aiming it at the excited women in the audience. His signature move, the duck walk, was a crowd favorite. Chuck would squat down and glide across the stage, bobbing his head to the beat. He later admitted that he invented the duck walk to hide the wrinkles in his suit, but it became a classic part of his act. Chuck's dynamic performances were matched by his groundbreaking sound. His songs typically started with a powerful guitar riff, followed by a chugging rhythm and a pounding backbeat. This distinctive sound defined early rock and roll. Chuck's guitar style was influenced by Carl Hogan, the guitarist in Louis Jordan's R&B band, and Les Paul, whose electrifying licks on hits like How High the Moon inspired him. Chuck's music often featured a call and response pattern, where his guitar would answer the vocals, creating a seamless blend of sound. His piano player, Johnny Johnson, complemented this with boogie-style playing, and the two became a tight-knit musical duo. However, some people have suggested that Chuck wasn't the sole composer of his hits. Keith Richards, the guitarist of the Rolling Stones, believes Chuck wrote all the lyrics but that Johnny Johnson might have helped with the music. Johnny initially denied this, but the question has lingered. In 2000, Johnny even sued Chuck for songwriting credits and back royalties, but the lawsuit was dismissed due to the statute of limitations. Despite these debates, Chuck Berry's music was a unique blend of R&B and country, with a strong pop influence. He understood the importance of catchy melodies and clever lyrics. His songs often referenced specific places, girls' names, and popular consumer goods, which resonated with white teenagers. This helped launch black artists into the mainstream. Songs like School Day and Sweet Little 16 spoke directly to the experiences of young people, and Roll Over Beethoven celebrated the rebellious spirit of rock and roll. Chuck's early records painted a picture of daily life in 1950s America. Maybelline talked about fast cars, 30 Days about crooked judges, and Too Much Monkey Business about the hassles of school and work. His music not only reflected the times, but also helped shape them. By bringing black rock and rollers to the forefront of pop music, Chuck played a significant role in promoting racial integration. He was amazed to see integrated audiences at rock and roll concerts, where white and black teenagers mixed freely. Some fans and music experts see Chuck as a trickster who used his music to challenge racial barriers. Songs like Johnny B. Good, Jojo Gun, Brown-Eyed Handsome Man, and Promised Land are interpreted as subtle critiques of racial attitudes. Chuck himself didn't always write with social commentary in mind, but he was aware of the impact his music had. He stood up to racists and bigots during his tours, and he was proud of the role he played in bringing people together through music. Chuck Berry's popularity in the 1950s was a combination of his sound, lyrics, and showmanship. His music was perfect for dancing, and his lyrics told stories that teenagers could relate to. On stage, he was a magnetic performer, and his influence extended far beyond the music itself. As Roll Over Beethoven predicted, Chuck Berry, a black man with an R&B influenced sound, became a major force in a predominantly white America. 1956 also saw the rise of another major African-American rock and roll star, Little Richard. Born in Macon, Georgia in 1932, Little Richard was a unique and flamboyant performer. His band, The Upsetters, was known for its outrageous appearance and energy. Little Richard wore flamboyant outfits, including capes, ruffled shirts, and shimmering suits. His hair was styled into a towering pompadour, and he often wore makeup and an earring. His performances were wild and energetic, and he quickly became one of the most important and successful artists in the early days of rock and roll. Little Richard's stage presence was like nothing the world had ever seen. He didn't just sing, he performed with a wild intensity that pushed the boundaries of rock and roll. Music scholar Arnold Shaw puts it best. He sang with an intensity and frenzy that marked the outer limits of rock and roll. Little Richard would scream and shout, and sometimes even walk on top of the piano or jump into the crowd. His performances were a mix of music and theater, designed to get the audience hyped up and ready for more. In the early 1950s, Little Richard was honing his style in small bars, where his wild look and even wilder songs were a hit. He wore flamboyant outfits and sang in a way that was both electrifying and a bit shocking. In 1955, he signed with Specialty Records, and his first recording session was almost a disaster. The producer, Bumps Blackwell, was blown away by Little Richard's outrageous appearance. His shirt was so loud it looked like a rainbow vomit, but was surprised when Little Richard sang in a sedate, almost boring way. The studio musicians weren't impressed either, but then something magical happened. Bumps took Little Richard to a local blues bar for lunch. As soon as they walked in, Little Richard transformed. The crowd, the piano, and the energy of the place brought out the real Little Richard. He started playing and singing Tutti Frutti, a song he had written and performed in bars for years. The original lyrics were pretty raunchy, but Bumps knew they needed to be toned down for a wider audience. They quickly cleaned up the lyrics, and the song was recorded in just 15 minutes. Little Richard wasn't sure about the tamer version, but it didn't matter. Tutti Frutti became a massive hit, reaching number 17 on the national charts. Even though Pat Boone's cover version also did well, the kids still wanted the original Little Richard's version. Little Richard's success with Tutti Frutti set the stage for more hits. He had to clean up his act a bit to get airplay, but his songs were still full of energy and sexual suggestion. Censors were always on the lookout, but Little Richard's style was so over the top that it was hard to take him seriously. He performed in outrageous costumes, sometimes dressed as the Queen of England or the Pope, making adults think he was harmless. But for teenagers, Little Richard was everything rock and roll stood for: defiance, sex, and freedom. He followed Tutti Frutti with hits like Long Tall Sally, Rip It Up, and Good Golly Miss Molly. In 1957, Little Richard's career took an unexpected turn. While touring in Australia and the Philippines, his plane had a near miss. He saw an engine on fire and promised God he would give up rock and roll if he survived. When the plane landed safely, he enrolled in a divinity school and became a preacher. He later returned to music, but he never had another major hit. Despite this, Little Richard's influence on rock and roll was immense. He inspired artists like Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and the Beatles, who all borrowed from his style. While Little Richard was making waves, other R&B artists were struggling to make the transition to rock and roll. Bo Diddley, for example, had a unique sound that blended Chicago blues with Southern influences. His 1955 hit Bo Diddley topped the R&B charts, but didn't cross over to the pop charts. Diddley's music was rooted in the blues, with a strong drum beat and a call and response style that was new and exciting. However, his earthy style and Southern accent might have been too alien for many white teenagers. Bo Diddley was born Ellis Bates in Mississippi, and was later adopted and renamed Ellis McDaniel. He moved to Chicago as a child and got his start in music at church. In his teens, he performed with street bands and got his big break when he walked into Chess Records and impressed the owners with a recording he had made on a Webco recorder. His first release, Bo Diddley, was a hit on the R&B charts, but it never made it to the pop charts. Despite this, Diddley believed his song was the first true rock and roll record. He credited Alan Freed, a popular DJ, with coining the term rock and roll and associating it with his music. Bo Diddley's influence on rock and roll is undeniable. His innovative sound and style paved the way for future artists, even if he didn't achieve the same level of mainstream success as Little Richard. Both artists were part of the changing landscape of music in the 1950s, bringing a new energy and excitement to rock and roll that would shape the genre for decades to come. Bo Diddley's music was more than just a catchy beat. It was a powerful blend of rhythm and blues, African roots, and raw energy that defined the early days of rock and roll. His signature Bo Diddley beat was a simple yet hypnotic rhythm that echoed the sounds of the Mississippi Delta and the streets of Chicago. This beat, also known as the ham bone beat or shave and a haircut 2 bits, became a staple in rock music, appearing in hits by Buddy Holly, the Rolling Stones, and The Who. But Bo Diddley's sound was more than just a drum beat. It was a reflection of his deep roots in the blues and R&B. Born in Macomb, Mississippi, Bo grew up surrounded by the sounds of the bayou and the blues. When he moved to Chicago as a child, he immersed himself in the city's vibrant music scene. His music was a fusion of these influences, creating a unique sound that was both familiar and groundbreaking. Bo Diddley was a pioneer in more ways than one. He was one of the first African-American artists to achieve national recognition during the rock and roll era. His performances were electrifying, with his signature cigar box, shaped guitar, and sharp, stylish outfits. He would strut across the stage, jumping and wiggling to the beat, and often played his guitar in unconventional ways, like between his legs. His stage presence was as powerful as his music, and he quickly became a favorite on rock and roll tours alongside other legends like Fats Domino and Carl Perkins. Despite his talent and popularity, Bo Diddley struggled to achieve the same level of commercial success as some of his contemporaries. His first hit on the national pop charts, Say Man, didn't come until 1959, and it only reached number 20. Many of his other songs never made it into the top 40. This was puzzling to many, including Bo himself, who knew he had the talent to make it big. One reason for this was the nature of his music. Bo's sound was rooted in the blues and R&B, which appealed more to a predominantly African-American audience. His songs often had a raw, primal quality that was too intense for mainstream pop radio. For example, Hey Bo Diddley, 1957, described a farm filled with women, which was too suggestive for many radio stations. His music also often featured vernacular lyrics and cultural references that were alien to a broader white audience. Say Man, for instance, was based on a game of verbal insults known as the Dozens, which was popular in African-American urban neighborhoods. While it became a hit, many white listeners saw it as just a funny novelty record. Bo Diddley's independence and refusal to compromise his music also played a role. Unlike other black artists who adapted their styles to appeal to white audiences, Bo remained true to his roots. He wouldn't change his songs or lyrics to fit what the record company or radio stations wanted. This made him a unique and respected figure, but it also limited his commercial success. The music industry of the 1950s was often unfair to black artists, and Bo was no exception. He believed that he and other black performers were cheated out of royalties and recognition because of racism. Racism also affected Bo's career in other ways. His appearance and attitude were often seen as threatening by white audiences. Bo was a large, handsome, and confident black man who commanded the stage. His performances excited both white and black female fans, which made some white male fans and parents uncomfortable. This tension sometimes worked against him, as seen in his appearance on Ed Sullivan's TV show in 1955. Despite being told to perform a different song, Bo played his own hit, Bo Diddley, shocking the host and producer. Bo was never invited back. Despite these challenges, Bo Diddley's influence on rock and roll cannot be overstated. His innovative use of guitar riffs, tremolo, reverb, and distortion paved the way for future generations of rock musicians. He was one of the first to include female musicians in his band, breaking barriers in the male-dominated world of rock. His music inspired countless artists, including Elvis Presley, the Rolling Stones, and the Beatles. Bo Diddley's legacy is not defined by his chart positions, but by his impact on the music industry and the culture of rock and roll. Bo Diddley's later career saw him receive the recognition he deserved. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987 and received Lifetime Achievement Awards from the National Academy of Recorded Arts and Sciences and the Rhythm and Blues Foundation. His 1955 hit, Bo Diddley, was honored by the Grammy Hall of Fame, and he was ranked 20th on Rolling Stone magazine's list of the top 100 artists of all time in 2004. Bo was pleased by these accolades, but he always felt that the recognition came too late. He knew he had influenced countless artists who went on to achieve great success, but he never received the financial rewards he deserved. "I'm happy that I finally got the recognition," he said. "But where is my money? I was making the money. but I didn't get it from the record company, you know. Bo Diddley's story is a testament to the power of music and the enduring impact of a true pioneer. In the mid-1950s, Bo Diddley was a towering figure in the world of rock and roll, even though he didn't achieve the commercial success of other early stars like Fats Domino, Chuck Berry, or Elvis Presley. Despite this, his influence was profound. Bo Diddley's electrified rhythm and blues helped shape the sound of early rock and roll. His songs, like Bo Diddley, I'm a Man, and Who Do You Love, became classics that spoke to the dreams and struggles of 1950s America. The rise of black R&B performers on the national pop charts was a sign of the cultural integration happening in America during this time. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum with landmark cases like Brown vs. Board of Education in 1954 and the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. These events were paralleled by the success of black R&B artists who were bringing their music to a wider audience. Behind the scenes, the music industry was a melting pot of racial and ethnic diversity. Independent labels like Chess, Atlantic, and others were pivotal in producing the R&B hits that dominated the charts. These labels were often run by a mix of white and black owners, songwriters, producers, and musicians. Most listeners only heard the final product and were unaware of the multicultural collaboration that went into making these songs. One of the best examples of this collaboration was the partnership between the Coasters and two young white songwriters, Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller. Leiber and Stoller met as teenagers in Los Angeles, and despite their initial differences, they formed a partnership that would change the face of rock and roll. They shared a deep passion for African American culture and rhythm and blues. They even tried to talk, act, and sing like black musicians, sometimes even arguing over who was the blackest. Their breakthrough came in 1953 when they wrote Hound Dog for Big Mama Thornton, which became a #1 hit on the R&B charts. This success led them to start their own label, Spark Records, and later to sign a production deal with Atlantic Records. Under their guidance, the Coasters became one of the most successful acts in rock and roll history, with hits like Searchin', Yakety Yak, and Charlie Brown. Leiber and Stoller were known for their ability to blend black and white musical forms in a way that resonated with both black and white audiences. They didn't just mimic African American culture, they lived it and made it accessible to millions of white listeners. Their songs were often mini plays, with each member of the group playing a role. The Coasters, in turn, brought these songs to life with their performances, creating a true collaboration between the songwriters and the performers. Despite the success, some critics accused Leiber and Stoller of perpetuating stereotypes. However, the Coasters themselves defended the songwriters, saying they shared a sense of humor and had the power to veto any lyrics they didn't like. The Coasters' Carl Gardner noted that these two Jewish kids understood his culture better than he did. The rise of Elvis Presley in 1956 further paved the way for black rock and roll artists. Elvis introduced many white listeners to rhythm and blues, and his enthusiasm for cat music inspired fans to explore the real thing. The growing popularity of black artists on the pop charts reflected the broader social and cultural changes in America. Opportunities for African Americans were opening up as the civil rights movement gained momentum. Cultural integration became common in the music industry as black and white artists worked closely together in recording studios, shared stages, and even toured together. The 1950s saw the emergence of many more black rock and roll artists, including James Brown, Jackie Wilson, Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, and the Drifters. These artists played a crucial role in transforming rock and roll into a cultural and racial melting pot, setting the stage for the integration of not just music but all of American society. The success of these artists and the collaboration between black and white musicians in the 1950s showed that rock and roll was more than just music. It was a powerful force for cultural change. It brought people together in a way that nothing else could, and it helped to break down the barriers of racial prejudice. For the teenagers of the 1950s, rock and roll was a potent mix of black and white music, and it was clear that the new sound was not in tune with the racial attitudes of the time. The music was a reflection of a changing America, and it was a harbinger of the cultural integration that would come in the decades to follow. As the 1950s rolled on, a new sound was taking the South by storm, rockabilly. This blend of country, blues, and a dash of rebellious spirit was sweeping through the cotton fields and honky-tonks, and it all started with one man, Sam Phillips. Sam Phillips, the founder of Sun Records in Memphis, Tennessee, had a knack for spotting talent. He saw it in Elvis Presley, and he saw it again in Carl Perkins. Born into a poor sharecropping family in Tiptonville, Tennessee, Carl Perkins grew up surrounded by the sounds of country and blues. He learned to play guitar from a local man named Uncle John, who taught him the blues, and he practiced with the country tunes of Bill Monroe and Ernest Tubb. By the mid-1950s, Carl was living in Jackson, Tennessee, where he and his brothers formed the Perkins Brothers Band. They played in local honky-tonks, experimenting with a mix of country and rhythm and blues. When Carl first heard Elvis Presley, he knew he had to try his luck at Sun Records. He packed up his car and drove to Memphis, hoping to catch Sam Phillips's attention. Phillips was impressed by Carl's raw talent and his ability to blend country and blues. He signed Carl to Sun Records, hoping that Carl might be the next big thing. One of Carl's first recordings at Sun was a song called Dixie Fried. It told the story of a wild southern boy named Dan who caused chaos in a night spot, but the song was more than just a tale. It was a perfect example of rockabilly blues with a country beat. Although Dixie Fried wasn't a major hit, it set the stage for Carl's big break. In 1956, Carl wrote and recorded Blue Suede Shoes, which became one of the most iconic rockabilly songs of all time. The song was a hit, reaching number 2 on the charts, just behind Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel. Carl and Elvis had a lot in common. Both grew up in the South, both started at Sun Records, and both had a flair for flashy, rebellious fashion. They even hit the charts on the same day, March 2nd, 1956. The success of Blue Suede Shoes paved the way for other rockabilly artists. Sam Phillips's Sun Records became the hub of this new sound, drawing in musicians from all over the South. Artists like Charlie Feathers, who remembered the unique sound of bluegrass and blues, and Jerry Naylor, who described rockabilly as a mix of rhythm guitar, lead guitar, and a slapback echo, all contributed to the growth of this genre. Rockabilly wasn't just a sound, it was a movement. It spoke to the young and the rebellious, those who wanted to break away from the music of their parents' generation. It was a fusion of country and blues, a sound that was uniquely American and uniquely Southern. As the 1950s came to a close, rockabilly had left an indelible mark on the music world, thanks to the vision of Sam Phillips and the talent of artists like Carl Perkins. The legacy of rockabilly continued to influence music for decades to come, inspiring new generations of musicians to blend different styles and create something fresh and exciting. In the end, it was about more than just the music. It was about the spirit of innovation and the power of a good story, set to a beat that made people dance.